My name is Dana Dennis-Smith. I am a trustee of Spark 21, the charity that manages the Next 100 Years campaign, which follows the first 100 Years campaign. This is our first event in person in 832 days. I always love my numbers, and I looked it up, and I cannot tell you how delighted we are to welcome you all in person to our third edition of the Heilbron Lectures, but also, importantly, to start the celebrations of 100 years of women qualifying in England and Wales. We're a little bit late compared to Scotland and Ireland, but we will be celebrating just as much. So tonight we have a really special theme, the theme of our lives, really, nature. And I'm delighted to have Professor Lavanya Rajamani with us tonight, who will be addressing the Heilbron lecture. We also have amazing guests among us. Lady Hale, our patron, thank you for being with us. Lady Arden, one of the Supreme Court justices that you will know was one of the third woman to be appointed to the bench. So it's really wonderful to have such an esteemed audience tonight to listen to this important theme. And without further ado, I'd like to invite to the stage our host, the Sheriff of London, Alison Gowman.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and a very, very warm welcome from me. I'm Alison Gowman, and I'm one of the two sheriffs of the City of London and an alderman of the City of London. This is the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court, and this is my home for the year. I'm sort of nominally in charge of the Old Bailey with my co-sheriff. Of course, there are really proper expert people who run it, but I do have a very important role here. For many of you, perhaps the lawyers here, the hallowed walls of the Old Bailey might be very, very familiar to you, for the best of reasons, I hope, or at least you don't seem too adrift from the importance of the role of criminal justice and the rule of law today. The magnificent building you're sitting in and under was opened in 1907. It's on the site of the very notorious Newgate prison. And that was the scene of many unhygienic and insalubrious conditions, as highlighted if you know your Charles Dickens. On many occasions, the men would pay the jailers in order to have access to the female cells. And actually, some women didn't mind too much because they could plead the belly, which means that if they were pregnant, they could be saved from the death sentence. Nowadays, it just means you don't get such a fast-track promotion. It's the current role as the Central Criminal Court is pivotal in criminal justice, and the major murder and terrorist cases from London and the South East are tried here. Most recently, the murderer convicted of the killing of David Amess MP was heard in Court Number 2, which is just across there, and many other notorious cases. Court Number 1, which some of you have visited, has many other sad tales to tell. I'm very pleased to report that we do just about have an equal number of male and female judges at the moment. One has just recently retired, one female judge has retired, but I think on the whole we have every kind of balance in the best sense of that word. But of course, it was the sitting here as the first female judge of Rose Heilbron 50 years ago this year that has sparked this lecture series, in a sense, or the name of this lecture series. And I'm very proud to think that from that start of one female judge, it has become a much more regular and more balanced set of judges here. As sheriff, I'm able to pursue a few sort of areas of work in conjunction with the city. And I have been a great supporter of sustainability and environmental matters over a very long period of my career. I'm looking forward, therefore, to tonight's lecture very much, because I've very much been part of the City Corporation's climate action strategy, which is that we will have all of our Scope 3, our full value emissions, to net zero by 2040. Alongside this is the complementary work that the city is pursuing around building resilience and infrastructure and flood resistance elements. The corporation has a bit of an advantage here because we own and manage over 4,000 hectares of open spaces around London. That includes Hampstead Heath and Epping Forest. And so we have the ability in that space to be able to build on the biodiversity and mixed habitat that's so important. We care for over 2,750 veteran pollarded trees, and we're creating new pollarded trees for the future, which are in fact an excellent way to ensure that we retain the carbon in the natural world. We hold an internationally important population of such trees. Climate action work such as sustainable planting and converting of our not very good arable land into wildflower meadows has been designed to make sure we take full benefit of biodiversity. And of course, some of you will know the city so well. We have 100 pocket parks, which we are planting with better and more diverse plants and trees, and greening the streets so that you can walk on a cooler street scene, I hope. Another element that I've actually been able to involve with is the work with young people in the Old Bailey, encouraging an understanding of the criminal justice system. We hold lots of events here all through the year, even before I became sheriff, working with young people who are concerned with knife crime, trying to divert them from that by giving them some very hard-hitting understanding of the impact of the criminal justice system. But one of the things, the nicest things I've been able to do is bring in young children, 16 plus, from state schools and academies, and being able to introduce them to the Bailey, introduce them to the judges, with whom I usually lunch, and they invite guests in. And it's been great for these young people to actually hear, but also to be heard by those judges and to be understood as to their aspirations for their careers. It's been very, very empowering. So, as you can hear, this building and my role has opened up so many opportunities, and not least the ability to have this Heilbron lecture here this year. So let me now pass over to our wonderful guest lecturer, Professor Rajamani. Please come forward. Thank you.
Good evening to you all. Thank you, Sheriff Gowman, for that very kind introduction, and to Dana, the Next 100 Years Initiative, for inviting me to speak as part of this incredibly prestigious lecture series. It is a tremendous honor to be speaking in a lecture series named after the legendary Dame Rose Heilbron, and to follow Kirsty Brimlau, QC, and the Law Commissioner, Professor Sarah Green, who delivered the previous lectures in this series. It is also incredible and unusual to be speaking to a room predominantly comprised of women, and incredibly accomplished women. So it is a true pleasure to be doing this today. And incredible women like Lady Hale and Lady Arden as well in the audience. These are all inspirational women who have many firsts to their names and to their credit, and who paved the way for generations of women to come. Even as we begin to recognize, in however nascent and hesitating a fashion, the enormous contribution that women have made to the law and to public life, there are still countless other women on whose shoulders we stand, whose achievements went unnoticed and whose voices were only heard by their families. I take great pride in the women in my family. My mother, a single parent who raised 2 children while holding office as a civil servant in India, my grandmother, who was an inspector of schools in Madurai, and my great-grandmother, who was a postmistress in Marthandam, South India. These women were true pioneers. They battled their families and society to work, to educate their daughters and teach them to be self-reliant at a time in which it is considered a disqualification for women of a certain class to be educated and self-reliant. They interrupted dominant social, cultural, and patriarchal narratives. It is such women who, through the challenging lives that they led and their daily acts of care, compassion, courage, and interruption, have enabled the generations that come after them to shine just a little brighter than they could. And to all these women, recognized and unrecognized, we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude. Our achievements are a product of their choices, sacrifice, and even discomfort. I'm heartened and delighted that the next 100 years initiative is seeking to platform and champion women in the law. The next 100 years will surely be better for us than the last. The title of my talk today is Climate Change and the Radical Potential of Outrage to Advance the Frontiers of Law. I will speak to the intractability of the climate change problem, the limits of existing international law in addressing the civilizational challenge of climate change, and the radical potential of outrage in confronting and advancing the boundaries of law. Outrage at the state of our planet, the bleak future that we are bequeathing to our children, and the unfairness at the heart of this problematic, within and among generations. I would like to begin, however, by stepping back and locating myself as an environmental law scholar. We are all connected to our environment in many ways. I draw sustenance from it daily, as I'm sure you do, too. Whether it is the dawn chorus that I wake up to, the magnolias in full bloom, in the spring in my back garden, or the uplifting buttercups in Port Meadows as I walk to work. Even though I was raised in the southern Indian metropolises of then Madras and Bangalore, the fragments of memory that make up my childhood are set against the glorious natural landscapes of India. The petrichor as the first monsoon rains hit the parched earth after a searing summer. The coconut trees swaying in the sheets of rain as my train whizzed past, carrying me to my cousins in Tuticorin for the summer vacations. The imposing Himalayas shrouded in cotton candy clouds, and the thundering waterfalls we stood under as children. But the environment is also a source of enormous anxiety to me, given our tenuous hold on nature, how much we've taken it for granted in our pursuit of a materialistic life, and how rapidly much of what we live and enjoy about our environment is changing beyond recognition. I lived in Delhi for several years as an adult, a sprawling, beautiful, and historic city teeming with culture, art, and yes, even nature. A green city once filled with one of the largest urban bird populations in the world, kites that swept down from the towering trees in Lodi gardens to snatch pieces of food from my then toddler's fingers, parrots that brightened the early morning hours with their antics, and the sparrows that flitted about on sunlit balconies. Delhi is today the world's most polluted capital city. The kites and parrots are few and far between, and the sparrows have all but disappeared. It is a city that I sadly had to leave to protect my lungs and allow my child's lungs to grow. The COVID crisis these last few years has also been a stark reminder to me of the profoundly altered relationship that we have with the natural environment. It has underscored the consequences of biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation for human health, well-being, and survival, and indeed for the day-to-day mechanics of our life, all of which changed dramatically in March of 2020. I see it as an omen of things to come on the climate. It is this acute anxiety I feel over our rapidly changing environment that fueled my interest in the law. Can law and regulation protect our environment? Can law protect us from humankind's excesses? Can it protect us from ourselves? I've spent my career seeking to answer this question in relation to the threat of climate change, characterized as the defining issue of our age by the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, or humanity's greatest threat in thousands of years by Sir David Attenborough, and the issue that will define the contours of the century more dramatically than any other, former US President Barack Obama. Successive reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have demonstrated that climate change is real, its impacts are discernible, and that it's occurring ever faster and in more devastating ways than once predicted. The latest assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change found that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land, and the scale of recent changes across the climate system are unprecedented over many centuries to many thousands of years. The global average surface temperature is already 1.1 degrees centigrade higher than pre-industrial periods, and 10 of the warmest years on record have occurred since 2005. Such climate change is causing increased heat waves, droughts, and floods. Heat waves are sweeping across the US and South Asia at the moment. And we have our own little version of a heat wave coming tomorrow. All of which are driving mass mortalities in species, not the heat wave tomorrow, but the others, driving mass mortalities in species such as trees and corals. Indeed, many scientists fear that the sixth mass extinction of species is underway. 1 million plant and animal species are likely to disappear, forever changing the world we leave to our children. Scientists tell us that we are already at various natural tipping points, beyond which environmental harms get exponentially worse, threatening the health and even the ultimate survival of humanity. And as these devastating impacts are unfolding, as heat waves spread across the world, glaciers melt, islands sink, wildfires rage, and storms and floods ravage the earth, greenhouse gas emissions have continued to rise. Indeed, average annual greenhouse gas emissions during 2010 to 2019, the last decade, were higher than in any previous decade. This is a damning indictment of the international community that seems to be, as many have said, fiddling as the world literally burns. The central and resounding message across a slew of scientific reports is that current patterns of production and consumption, population growth, and technological development are unsustainable. Full stop. In the absence of transformative change involving all states, sectors of the economy, and across the full gamut of stakeholders, irreversible and unprecedented environmental harm will be unleashed on the planet. Margaret Atwood, in the eerily prescient Mad Adam trilogy, asks, what if we continue down the road we're already on? How slippery is the slope? What are our saving graces? Who's got the will to stop us? Sovereign states? Us? As the science has become more certain and the impacts more tangible, the issue of climate change has climbed up the political agenda. The UN climate change negotiations in the early years attracted a few thousand participants and a couple of dozen heads of states. Today, it attracts dozens and dozens of heads of states, hundreds in fact. The 2015 Paris Agreement attracted 150 heads of state and 38,000 participants. The 2021 Glasgow conference, held in the middle of the COVID crisis, attracted 120 heads of state and 25,000 participants. Notwithstanding this increasing political salience, though, the issue of climate change has proven remarkably resistant to resolution. Why? Why has climate change proven to be such an intractable problem? It is because it is of what it has come to be characterized in the literature as a super wicked policy challenge. A super wicked policy challenge. Climate change is caused by a wide range of production and consumption processes. Its causes and effects are global and require complex collective action, can be addressed only if all the major greenhouse gas emitters are willing to undertake potentially costly, large-scale transformations in their economic and energy systems. Yet, since the benefits of climate change mitigation are shared by the international community as a whole, rather than just the countries that take action, the major emitters have very little incentive to act on their own. Moreover, such transformations require buy-in from citizens, from all of us, a willingness to behave differently, to adjust lifestyles, to rethink aspirations. It demands change and sacrifice from all of us. Climate change has consequences for what we aspire to, how we get to work, what we drive, how we grow our food, where we grow the food that we eat, how we transport our food, what we eat, how we travel, where we holiday. We need to rethink all these in systemic terms and to make all of society changes to address it. Yet many states are reluctant to make all of society changes. As erstwhile US President George Bush Sr. famously declared in 1992, the American way of life is not up for negotiation, period. And so it has proven. The US withdrawal from the Kyoto Protocol during the Bush years and its withdrawal from the Paris Agreement during the Trump years are examples of this. In former US President Trump's words, the Paris Accord would undermine our economy, hamstring our workers, weaken our sovereignty, impose unacceptable legal risks, and put us at a permanent disadvantage to the other countries of the world. It is time to exit the Paris Accord. While the US is back, again, to the UN climate fold, the lingering, politically consequential vein of climate skepticism and denial, fueled by powerful lobbies, remains a threat to meaningful climate action, and not just in the US. Australia's emissions continue to rise under the previous Conservative government with its regressive climate policies. In both countries, there are signs of hope that electoral swings, at least in part, small part, because of positions on climate change, will lead to more ambitious action. But it remains to be seen how far these political changes will trigger all of society transitions. Skepticism is rife in some developing countries as well. In the last 3 years in Brazil, under the Bolsonaro government, there's been an alarming increase in deforestation, by some estimates up to 34% in the Amazon rainforest, and a 10% increase in greenhouse gas emissions from forest fires. In other developing countries, even if not fueled by climate skepticism, there is limited buy-in for costly transformations that bear significant opportunity costs in terms of investments in poverty eradication, energy access, and other developmental needs. Finally, at the irresolvable core of international climate politics is the issue of equity and fairness between and within developed and developing countries, between those responsible for triggering climate change and those on the front lines of its impacts, and between our generation and the ones to come. States have fundamentally different national circumstances, greenhouse gas emission profiles, and vulnerabilities. Historically, the vast majority of cumulative CO2 emissions from 1850 to today have been emitted by developed countries. The US alone is responsible for 20% of all carbon dioxide emitted since 1850 and is responsible by itself for about 0.2 degrees centigrade of warming. Yet annual emissions from developing countries are growing. Currently, annual emissions of developing countries are over 60% of the total CO2 emissions, and emissions from large developing countries are projected to keep rising. In 2005, China surpassed the US as the world's largest emitter of CO2. Between 2000 and 2015, emissions from developing countries increased by 79%, while emissions from developed countries fell by about 14.8%. Climate change clearly cannot be addressed without ambitious mitigation actions from major developing countries. Many developing countries, however, have very low per capita emissions, and these are likely to grow to meet their social and development needs. Take India, for example. Its per capita emissions are 1.8 tons, which is much below the US average of 15.2 tons. China's are higher than India's, 7.4 tons per year. Those of the EU, and it's actually higher than those of the EU, which is 6.4 tons. Notwithstanding some blurring of the lines between developed and developing countries, there remain persistent inequalities between those that live in the developed world and those that live in developing countries. An estimated 940 million people, 13% of the world's population, do not have access to electricity. And COVID increased that number by 2% in 2021. For many developing countries, the burden of addressing energy poverty is crippling. Another critical dimension to the equity debate is that countries primarily responsible for causing climate change are not the ones that will be most adversely affected. Small island states, for instance, that have begun to lose their territories to rising sea levels have a compelling reason to act. But their greenhouse gas emissions are negligible. And they will, even if they reduce their emissions, they will have no impact on the trajectory of warming. So they have little apart from the moral high ground as leverage in negotiations that often descend into secret deals between major emitters. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, on the other hand, economically dependent on fossil fuels, with very high per capita emissions, have compelling reason to act, at least in the short term, for inaction, compelling reasons for inaction and obstructionism in the climate change negotiations. A final crushing unfairness at the heart of the climate change problematic is intergenerational unfairness. We are leaving not just a ravaged world to our children, but also the overwhelming burden of addressing the environmental harms that we've created. It is this seemingly irresolvable and intractable problem that the community of sovereign states has been seeking to address over the last 3 decades. And in the process, the limits of existing international law in addressing this civilization challenge have become all too evident. If climate change is indeed the defining challenge of our age, our response to it so far is a withering comment on our civilization. Although the international community has been in negotiations for over 3 decades and agreed on 3 international instruments, the Paris Agreement being the most recent, the 2015 Paris Agreement, the 1992 Framework Convention being the first, and the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, these instruments have made just a dent in business as usual. The international climate change regime, which is a product of consensus-based decision-making among states that are deeply protective of their autonomy and sovereignty, is located in the sweet spot between the red lines of parties, and therefore has perhaps inevitably settled at the least common denominator. It is fundamentally limited in at least 4 ways. First, and rather counterintuitively, the international climate change regime does not oblige states to take specific greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and to achieve them. The 2015 Paris Agreement creates a binding procedural obligation on states to submit nationally determined contributions. But these contributions are nationally determined, not multilaterally negotiated. And states are given considerable autonomy in choosing the content of these contributions. There is no mechanism to review the content of these contributions, no mechanism to review the adequacy of these contributions or to judge them for their fairness or for their ambition. And there is no obligation of result attached to these contributions, which means that states are not obliged to achieve the contributions that they choose for themselves. Such national autonomy has not surprisingly resulted in national contributions that do not add up to what we need it to add up to reach 1.5 degrees centigrade or even well below 2 degrees centigrade temperature limit. The first round of national contributions from states put us on track to an over 3-degree temperature rise. The current contributions in place put us on a pathway to 2.4 degrees centigrade temperature rise. To be clear, these are just promises at this point and projections based on promises. They have not been implemented. Under current policies, the global average temperature is set to increase by 2.7 degrees centigrade. The IPCC's latest report made it clear that given current emission trends, even with deep cuts to 2030, an overshoot is inevitable. An overshoot, that is, temperatures will exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade before, we hope, coming back down. The second fundamental limit in the international climate change regime is that it does not contain a mechanism to generate accountability for the targets that states take on. So not just are states permitted to choose the content of their obligations, not just are they not required to achieve these obligations, there is also no mechanism that generates any accountability for the targets that states have taken on. There is a transparency framework, there's a compliance framework, but most of these exclude a robust review function. Third, the international climate change regime contains very limited avenues for fairness and equity concerns to be addressed. A central question in the negotiations, as you might expect, right from the start, has been how to fairly share the burden of addressing climate change. What is each country's fair share, and how can we ensure that each country is doing its fair share? This is a deeply contentious question, and in the interest of reaching consensus, the Paris Agreement sidesteps this question and deliberately leaves only few carefully curtailed avenues for issues of equity and fairness to be raised. One such avenue is that states are encouraged to explain when they submit their contributions, how these contributions are fair and ambitious. Needless to say, states offer very self-serving narratives of how their contributions are fair. For instance, 110 states have argued that their targets are fair because their contributions to greenhouse gas emissions constitutes just a small proportion of the global total. But if you add the contributions of these 110 states together, it constitutes over a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. Fairness in the climate change regime, like ambition, is self-determined. States determine fairness for themselves. Fourth and finally, there's a fundamental mismatch in the climate change regime between promises made and promises kept, in particular in relation to financial support. There's an implementation gap. The vast majority of the national contributions that have been put forward by developing countries are contingent on the provision of financial support. But there's very limited financial support available. Developing countries had pledged in 2009 to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020. But in 2021 in Glasgow, they acknowledged with deep regret that this promise could not be kept. And $100 billion per year is only a fraction of what is needed. The International Energy Agency identifies the real need as $4 trillion by 2030 per year by 2030 to make the transformational changes that we need to make to get us on track to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's latest report has found that current levels of finance are 3 to 6 times below what is needed to get us on track to 1.5. So it is very clear that international law has not advanced apace with the science. The political will that animates the climate change regime ebbs and flows, as we see with the US and the Paris Agreement, and the US and the Kyoto Protocol. Compromises are reached through constructive ambiguity that often allows issues to fester, and progress is so slow and incremental, the narrow window of opportunity that is left to avert the most dangerous climate change is nearly closed. So the world has arrived at a biosphere tipping point, the edge of a precipice. Despite the state of planetary emergency, there are clear limits to what the current architecture of international law, which is hostage to national will and politics, can do and can be expected to do. If international law is to do more, it must move beyond the constraints of the current architecture and framing and embrace a fundamental reconceptualization of existing models of governance. But fundamental realignments of the scale required demand imagination. Imagination that is both outrageous and fueled by outrage. Outrage can be epistemically productive. It generates knowledge about fairness. It generates attention to unfairness. Indeed, it prevents unfairness from becoming invisibilized as harm. Outrage builds support, fosters solidarity, and thrives on passion and connection. It is outrage that we hear in the searing words of Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados. We refuse to be relegated to the footnotes of history, she says, and to be collateral damage for the greed of others. It is outrage we hear in the words of Hubert Minnis, Prime Minister of the Bahamas. Small island countries are on the front lines of being swallowed into an abyss, created initially by human activity and increasingly by inaction. It is outrage we hear in the words of Vanessa Nakate, youth activist from Uganda, as she draws the eyes of the world to the loss and damage suffered as a consequence of climate change. You cannot adapt to lost cultures. You cannot adapt to lost traditions. You cannot adapt to lost history. You cannot adapt to starvation. You cannot adapt to extinction. And it is outrage that we hear in the words of Greta Thunberg. We deserve a safe future, and we demand a safe future. Is that really too much to ask? It is outrage that galvanizes children to strike school, investors to divest from fossil fuels, and activists to occupy oil rigs, block fossil fuel extraction, glue themselves to stock exchanges, tunnel under rail construction lines, and fly drones into Heathrow Airport. It is outrage. Outrage can also be legally productive. Outrage has triggered a gathering storm of cases, many experimental and pushing the boundaries of law, before national, regional, and international courts. Cases that challenge governments for insufficient ambition, for doing less than their fair share, and for passing the burden on to future generations. They challenge even fossil fuel companies for failing in their duty of care. While many of these cases have failed, often on procedural grounds, some of the creative arguments advanced by litigants on a wing and a prayer are beginning to find their mark. In the Milestone Urgenda case in 2019, the Dutch Supreme Court, approached by a 900-strong citizens group, found the Dutch government's climate ambition inadequate and ordered the state to do its fair share and reduce emissions by at least 20%, 25% in 2020 compared to 1990. In the Neubauer case in 2021, the German Federal Constitutional Court ordered Germany to enhance its climate ambition, since fundamental rights, and I'm quoting, as intertemporal guarantees of freedom afford protection against greenhouse gas reduction burdens being unilaterally offloaded onto the future. Interestingly, experimental cases against fossil fuel companies are also beginning to enjoy early successes in court. In the fascinating case of Milieu Defensi, in 2021, the Hague District Court ordered Shell to reduce its emissions by 45% by 2030 relative to 2019, holding that Shell had a duty of care to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions given the science and the Paris Agreement. And there are many potentially pivotal cases in the pipeline, brimming with innovative legal arguments. At the international level, the small island state of Vanuatu, the state that has been judged as the world's most at-risk country for natural hazards, battered by Category 5 cyclones, is spearheading a campaign to seek an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the responsibilities of states in relation to climate harm. Surely the international climate change regime, with its fundamentally limited and limiting approach, is not the last word on the responsibilities of states in relation to climate harms that they unleash on others. There is a tapestry of interlocking international obligations and norms, including but not limited to the UN climate change regime, which tell us much about the rights and responsibilities of states in relation to climate harms. A question we don't yet know but have a conclusive answer to, and the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, could provide us a definitive and compelling response. At the regional level, a group of angry young Portuguese climate activists have brought a case in the European Court of Human Rights, the Agostinho case, demanding that 33 countries across Europe increase their climate ambition as they're not doing their fair share to address climate change. And at the national level, Luciana Luya versus RWE, pending the German courts, is trialing another boundary-defining legal argument. A Peruvian farmer living in Juarez, Peru, has filed claims against RWE, Germany's largest electricity provider, arguing that its large quantities of greenhouse gas emissions have led to RWE bearing some measure of responsibility for the melting of mountain glaciers near his hometown of Juarez. Needless to say, these cases are few and far between. And even when they do advance the frontiers of law, they will not deliver by themselves a stable climatic future. However, they do demonstrate the potential of outrage. They demonstrate that outrage will find avenues for legal expression, and innovative legal arguments will have their day in court. I hope that such cases with liberal cross-fertilization across jurisdiction will catalyze political will and trigger transformational change, one state at a time, one sector at a time, and one person at a time. While much of what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has had to say in recent times has been sobering, a code red for humanity, as the UN Secretary General termed it, the report released in April did also offer a glimmer of hope. The costs of renewable technologies, solar, wind, and batteries have fallen by 85% in the last decade. Options to halve emissions in all sectors exist by 2030. And there is sufficient global capital and liquidity to close investment gaps. So 1.5 degrees centigrade, or at least a well below 2 degrees centigrade world, is within our reach. But we need popular ownership, political will, and solidarity to support just transitions across all sectors and states. As lawyers, if we do not push the frontiers of law, and indeed all of society, to help us deliver a climate-stable future, our response to the Irish poet Theo Dorgan's "The Question" will be one steeped in regret. The Question by Theo Dorgan: when the great ships come back, and come they will, when they stand in the sky all over the world, candescent suns by day, radiant cathedrals in the night, how shall we answer the question? What have you done with what was given you? What have you done with this blue, beautiful world? Thank you for listening.
So before Professor Rajamani steps down from the stage, we want Amici has agreed to take some questions from the floor. I'd like to see some courage coming forward from so many women. I'll come to some of you, not everybody, but she's staying with us for the reception, so bear with me.
Oh, no worries. Hi, thank you very much for your speech. This isn't so much a question, but just something that came into my mind. I grew up in Libya, and my day-to-day life was taken over by war, making sure I was alive. Sorry, my voice is shaky a bit. I only just left Libya, and now I'm training to be a solicitor. But in Libya, climate change was an afterthought, you know? It wasn't, and forgive my poor choice of words, it wasn't tangible enough for us to care because everyday life was so critical. And you mentioned that we need costly, large-scale action to do something. But I just wanted to genuinely ask, how can countries like Libya, war-torn countries, realistically take steps to combat climate change, especially when it's something so global and everyday domestic issues seem more pressing? Thank you.
Thank you. That's Dana, do you want me to answer one?
Yes, please.
So that's actually an excellent question. And while you are talking about sort of countries that are war-torn, there are countries, you know, one of the challenges in these negotiations is there are countries that have very different priorities and very legitimate different priorities to others. And I think the answer lies in solidarity. And I think this entire issue can only be resolved if we exhibit some degree of solidarity. It's not about leaving each country to their own or each person to their own. We need systemic change. We need transformational change. And that transformational change will only come if we can support each other. So for countries like Libya, or even for countries in sub-Saharan Africa that, you know, a large proportion of their population don't have access to electricity, we need to provide support for those countries because it is about taking everybody along. We don't leave countries or people behind in this transformation that we're looking for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you use the word outrage a lot, which is a good word and a strong word. One thing, and fossil fuel companies in particular talk a lot about, is the so-called just transition. What do you think of that? It does seem in some cases that mining companies support a lot of local workers, etc. How can we somehow marry the two so that the damage they do is sort of offset? Can we say offset?
Thank you. Another great question. Absolutely. We can only resolve this issue if there are just transitions, not just transitions in the energy sector, but just transitions across the world, across all sectors. So by just transitions, I understand this to mean, I mean, there are lots of different sort of lenses through which you can approach just transitions, but I understand just transition to mean that we need transformational change across all sectors. We cannot continue with business as usual, but there are investments in business as usual. There are people who have jobs in the fossil fuel industry and other industries, and we need to take everybody along. So in response to the first question as well, I spoke about solidarity and support amongst the community of international actors, but amongst different stakeholders as well. We can only do this if we all support each other. It does need to be just. It needs to be fair. We can't have huge costs, impose huge costs on particular sectors or particular segments of society or particular individuals. And right now we are imposing huge costs. Our actions are imposing huge costs on the small island states or the least developed countries and sort of vulnerable countries. So we do need to balance that out and ensure that we are actually transitioning in a just way across sectors to a more sustainable future.
Thanks so much. I wanted to ask you a question about civil disobedience. Activists who break the law to draw attention to the problem of climate change basically just get locked up. and find that the law is not on their side. How can that in itself change? Or is the law fundamentally an engine of the status quo?
So the law is an engine of the status quo. I think you answered your question there. And that is why I've been making a case for outrage to fuel change in the law. And the cases that I've been talking about, not specifically on civil disobedience, although there are some cases on that as well, the cases I've been speaking about are actually actors trying to change the law, because the law is a sort of instrument of the status quo. So it is that change in the law, but law can also be an instrument of social engineering. So when we do find law and we do sort of advocate for laws that are more sort of constructive in the way that they deal with civil disobedience, advocate for laws that are more constructive in the way they manage just transitions, in the way they provide support to those that are left behind in these transitions, those laws are instruments of social engineering as well. So we need to move from law as status quo to law as an instrument of social engineering.
You ended your lecture mentioning, the biblical calling of what have you done with your talents, and the responsibility that we have as solicitors or lawyers to perhaps be at the forefront of change. And I wanted to have your opinion about, we are sitting here in the City of London, where one of the city's greatest assets are its financial markets, and the fact that through ESG rules and new laws, we can try to rein in the financial markets, or at least direct investment into social changes. I was at a conference 2 weeks ago where in the city, at the headquarters of a major bank, where the speaker mentioned how ESG obligations and how the banks and the financial markets could advance gay rights. Of all things, I never thought as a gay man that this could be actually an actual engine of change. What can you tell us about your hopes for ESG and such regulations to advance, to nudge better behavior from major corporations?
So I think most regulations that are currently in play have had some impact, but not as much impact as we would like, because the kinds of changes that we're looking for are transformational changes, and those kinds of changes haven't yet been put in place. But it's a first step. I think there is a long way to go. In terms of directing investments towards the kinds of engineering that we want to do in society in favor of the environment, we do need to invest a lot of time and attention to that, because like I said, in terms even of climate change, investments, financial flows and investments are now 3 to 6 times below what is needed to actually get us on pathway to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So we need, and that is a huge sort of gap. And that gap's only going to be bridged if you have transformational change. So tweaking at the margins is only going to get us so far. And I think much of what we're doing is tweaking at the margins. Thank you.
Hi. Just dovetailing on some of the questions that have been asked. Currently, and listening to the very, very detailed and very informative talk you've given, there seems to be a focus on voluntary targets, a lot of personal, states level voluntary targets and missions. How long, in your expert opinion, do you feel that it will get to sanctions being imposed rather than having voluntary targets that nobody seems to, quite frankly, care about? And they have justifications that can be, they are produced and they're held up because it is all voluntary, and as long as they're coming along, everybody's happy. So how far, because the next generation will see, like you said, a worse version of the world. So is that on the horizon, or is that something that isn't likely to be the case? Thank you.
I think there's a simple answer to that. Never. We're never going to have sanctions in this area. And part of the reason I say that is because international law is made by sovereign states that are deeply protective of their autonomy. So you have to actually get consensus amongst sovereign states to impose sanctions on themselves. So you're not going to get that. And we actually sort of experimented with that in the international climate change regime, because the Kyoto Protocol and the model that was followed in the Kyoto Protocol is a targets and timetables approach. It was only for developed countries, but the model that was followed was that developed countries would have targets, greenhouse gas emission reduction targets that were listed in an annex. They were set to particular timetables. There would be a compliance committee with an enforcement branch. There would be penalties for non-compliance. It was not popular. So, and was not just was it not popular, it was not effective, because the only countries that were subject to that were developed countries. And in the first commitment period, 2008 to 2012, that covered about 24% of global emissions. The US backed out of the Kyoto Protocol. Canada withdrew. Many countries withdrew because that was just not a model that was palatable to many countries. And in the next commitment period, 2012 to 2020, and the Paris Agreement kind of took over from that, it only covered 12% of global emissions. So you can have that architecture. So we've experimented with that architecture. And for lawyers, for all of us, I think it's a deeply and intuitively attractive model. You have clear obligations of result. You have, backed by a compliance system with penalties for non-compliance. But it was not popular among sovereign states. And not just developed countries that didn't want to do that. Developing countries didn't want that. So if you're going to extend targets to developing countries, they were not going to be interested in taking on targets that they would then be held to compliance assessments for. So I'm afraid there aren't going to be sanctions. There are no sanctions on the horizon, attractive though they might be, given the gravity of the problem.
Oh, this will be the last question. Not the last word, just the last question.
Thank you so much for your inspiring talk. And I expect that there are many of us in the audience who would like to do something, would like to become activists, but we're not specialists in climate change. What's your advice to us? How can we be part of making some positive, impactful change?
So it's a great question. I think, well, positive impact, of course, starts from ourselves. So, what we eat, how we drive, what we drive, how often we take vacations. These are all things that we can start changing, I think at a personal level. But I would like to say that there are limits to that, because there need to be systemic changes. Because if it is just not possible for you to get to work on time with public transport, or if public transport is incredibly expensive, then that's not a viable option for many of us. So there do need to be systemic changes to support these changes that we make at a personal level. But we have to be willing to accept that our lifestyles are going to change. We need to be willing to change. And I think that's where it starts from, I think, in terms of making a difference. Just the willingness to change and to adapt to this new reality in the context of systemic change. And for that systemic change, we do need to advocate for that systemic change. It's not going to happen without actually going to the polls and displacing people and governments that are not invested in that systemic change. So that's another way in which we can make change happen.
So we concluded the questions. You're released.
Okay.
Now you're in jail here, just before everybody's released, to have fun and maybe to muse over what we heard. I'll have a few words to say from the next 100 years. And the first thing that I want to say before inviting our patron, Lady Hale, to address you with her remarks is that we don't have next 100 years by the sound of it. So we are ambitious and we want to drive change for women, but we don't have time for women or for nature or for many of the pressing topics of our time. So if there's one message we take away, we've got to act today. So we've been busy when we couldn't see you all in person, and as you know, we've transformed from the first 100 years celebrating the first woman in law to the next 100 years to try to move on some of the pressing issues, such as the gender pay gap and all these stubborn things that don't seem to go away for women and other people that are trying to enter the legal profession, maybe to be outraged and drive this change we need. So maybe it's time for a different way of thinking, as we've just heard. So what's coming next? As we're celebrating the centenary of Women in Law this year, we've launched with Owen Mitchell, and I know they are here in the audience, a new series of videos celebrating the next 100 voices of women in law of our generation, women that are making a difference today. And that's a series of videos, and we're putting it out over the coming months. The first one was released last month. We also obviously continue elevating the voices of women as legal experts, not just women talking about being a woman in law, but about what they know as a woman in law. We have a lot of initiatives. Stay close to us. We will continue to celebrate, to mark important anniversaries. We are a charity, and we're grateful for every single one who contributed to make tonight so special. Thank you so much, and Lady Hale, over to you.
Well, I'm here to say thank you. Thank you, of course, first to the great Dana Dennis-Smith for celebrating not only for celebrating the first 100 years and the next 100 years, which of course we've all got to make sure do happen, but also for instituting this lecture series and being so astute in the lecturers that you have chosen. Always right on the button, if I may say so. So congratulations and thank you, Dana. You've certainly woken us up this evening, as indeed has our lecturer, for whom many great thanks for your truly outrageous lecture. It has woken us up to all the things that we have to worry about and think about and take action about. But I also want to say thank you for starting with a tribute to your mother, your grandmother, and your great-grandmother, because I think all of us women, recognize how much we owe to the inspirational figures of the women who gave birth to us and nurtured us, and in my case, really inspired me, and I learned a lot from her. So thank you for starting with that. And thank you also for starting with the wonderful vision of nature as it used to be, and as it sometimes still is. You know, up in my garden in North Yorkshire, I can still hear the birds and flowers and so on. But of course, it's what we want to try and get back to, although it was all our fault that it's gone away. And I suppose thank you for depressing us about the prospects of international law doing anything very much. But on the other hand, encouraging us that actually national law and individual small acts of activism can prod in a different direction. But I suppose the major message that I've got, apart from all the things that we must all try and do, both as individuals and as lawyers, which I think we're all worrying about and not necessarily doing much about it, but we can do more, is, I'm afraid my last message to everybody is one of huge regret that we seem to have in this country a government which is less and less inclined to adhere to its international obligations. I worded that very carefully, as you can imagine, but I think it is the job of every single lawyer, woman or man, and supporters of the law to fight for our government's adherence to its international obligations and to improve its international obligations. So that's one of the main messages that I want us all to go away with. But a renewed thanks hugely for your lecture, which I'm sure, although it has outraged us all, it has also inspired us all. Thank you.
Big thank you to our host, the Sheriff of London. Super exciting to have a woman in that job. To our lecturer, to Lady Hale, and to each and one of you. Thank you and see you next time in real life.